Most of the previous segments have looked at large swaths of biblical text. I'd like to step back for a moment and take a look at a single biblical text in some detail. I'll be doing that in this segment and in the segment that follows. I've chosen what is within Judaism one of the most important chapters in the book of Genesis, the beginning of Genesis chapter 22, called the Akedah, which means the binding, namely the binding of Isaac. What I'd like to do for this segment is to read through sections of this text in English, making certain observations, giving you a sense of certain elements that you might miss when reading this text very quickly. It begins, sometime afterward. The Hebrew is Vayihi achar hadvarim ha'eleh, which translates literally, after these things. Please remember that. It will be important for understanding the next segment. Sometime afterward, or after these things, God put Abraham to the test. Note, I do not believe that the Bible believes that its God is omniscient. I think this is a real test. God wants to see how Abraham is going to respond. The rest of the verse, God calls upon Abraham, and Abraham answers in the biblical equivalent of yes. There is no biblical Hebrew word for yes, and thus here I am, hineni, reflects yes in the English language. Verse 2 in your translation really is in some ways inaccurate. Let me translate it a little bit better. And he, God, said, take your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac. Isaac is at the end of the phrase. And what are you to do with that son? Go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. I'll just put in parentheses here. God says that he will point out the particular place where Isaac is to be offered. Does God ever do that in this section? Verse 3, so early next morning, Abraham saddled his ass and took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. And again, if you have an opportunity to read the article Mimesis by Eric Auerbach, which is part of this unit, you will understand this point at greater depth. The Bible typically does not express emotions directly, but it does through various actions which are narrated. So it doesn't express Abraham's angst, nor does it say about Abraham, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and do this. But note the way verse 3 begins. Abraham does not tarry. He does this action early in the morning. But also note when it narrates what Abraham took with him, his ass, his 2 servants, and his son Isaac. I think expressing some reluctance on going ahead with this because he's waiting at the end. Taking Isaac is the last action that he accomplishes. And again, he takes these various things at the rest of the verse, and he moves on. Verse 4, on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place from afar. I'll just ask you, I don't have a great answer for this. How did Abraham know that he had found the place? After all, as I pointed out earlier, God said that he's to sacrifice Isaac on the heights that I will point out to you. This is not pointed out. Again, going back to Auerbach and his famous phrase, this passage is, quote, fraught with background. Very little that we would expect is foregrounded. Much of it is in the background. Verse 5, Abraham tells his servants to stay put, and he says, the boy and I will go up there, we will worship, and we will return to you. I actually think a better translation of this Hebrew would be, and may we return to you. I don't think that Abraham is lying here, but is expressing a wish that they will both come back together. Verse 6, Abraham is putting the wood on his son Isaac. Abraham is carrying the dangerous stuff, the firestone and the knife. I think this suggests that Isaac is a little kid. He's too young to be trusted with a big knife for slaughter and with a firestone. But nevertheless, the end of verse 6, the two of them walked off together. Verse 7 is remarkable both for what it says and for what it does not say. Then Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father." And he answered, "Yes, my son." And he said, "Here's the firestone and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering?" Isaac is clearly getting a little uncomfortable here for good reason. But please note how the narrator emphasizes the terror in this text by using as many times as possible words like father and son in this particular verse. In other words, it's not some unknown kid that Abraham is taking, but Abraham the father is taking his son Isaac, who is able to ask about the firestone in the wood, but I think is too nervous to ask about the knife. He can't even get the word knife out of his mouth. And in verse 8, Abraham provides a non-answer answer. Oh, may God provide. Yet nevertheless, even after Abraham recites that non-answer answer and Isaac hears it, the end of verse 8, and the two of them walked on together. This is a refrain appearing twice in this episode. I'm not going to read all of the following verses, but one scholar I think has brilliantly pointed out that verse 9 makes it sound like Abraham is doing all of these activities in his sleep. It's as if he is sleepwalking, because that is the only way he could get himself to do these horrible things, culminating with binding Isaac on the altar on the wood. Verse 10, Abraham picks up the knife. By the way, the Hebrew word is ma'achelet, which is not a small knife, but it's used rarely in other places in the Bible. It's a big knife, big enough as in its use in the book of Judges to dismember a person. So please imagine that as you try to visualize this narrative and think of it as I believe it is a text of terror. And at the very last moment, verse 11, and quite strikingly, it's not God who calls out, but an angel of the Lord who calls out, doubling Abraham's name. Abraham, Abraham. Think about that. We're going to return to that in the next segment. And Abraham answers, Hineni, yes, here I am, the same word used in the beginning. And emphatically, this angel needs to say, do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him. See the doubling that you have there, for now I know that you fear God, and so forth. In other words, what I said earlier, that God is not imagined as omniscient, is clearly the case here. For now I know. And then luckily, verse 13, when Abraham looks up, he finds a ram. He offers that ram in place of his son. And then in verse 14, names this place Adonai Yireh, which means either the Lord will see or the Lord will provide, or as it says at the end of this verse, on the mount of the Lord there is vision. Please note, this text never says that the temple is going to be built on Mount Moriah, but according to later Jewish tradition, found first in the 4th century biblical book, the book of Chronicles, Mount Moriah is associated with Jerusalem and with the temple site in Jerusalem. And if that is standing behind these few verses and known by it, then part of what this section, the binding of Isaac, is doing is offering an etiology, a story of origin, explaining why the Jerusalem temple needs to be built in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. Namely, it is a place where the first significant sacrifice by an ancestor was given, where Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac as a burnt offering to the Lord. So that is one function the story has. And please note, this story never says or never intimates that its purpose is to abolish human sacrifice. The Bible talks about human sacrifice in other places, in some cases saying that it is detestable, in some cases suggesting that it was permissible, done, and efficacious. Contrary to what most people were told in Hebrew school, this is not a polemic against human sacrifice. Had it been so, the text would have clearly said at this point, Abraham, thank you very much for being willing to sacrifice your son. I will never ask anybody to do that again. That is not what happens. Instead, what does happen in the following verses, in verses 15 through 18, Abraham is blessed in the same way he is blessed at the beginning of chapter 12. In the beginning of chapter 12, it is an initial blessing. Here it is a blessing at the end of the Abraham cycle. The contents of the blessing are more or less the same. Abraham is going to have lots of descendants. Those descendants are going to control the land of Israel, and other nations will bless themselves by Abraham. The story comes to a conclusion quite anticlimactically in verse 19. And this is a remarkable difference between modern ways of telling stories and biblical ways of telling stories. You expect some giant climax after Isaac is almost sacrificed. Instead, verse 19, Abraham then returned to his servants, and they departed together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. I will leave you, but not answer for you the most obvious question. And where is Isaac?